So for us here in East Texas, the utilization of cool season annual legumes is very popular, primarily for the purpose of the potential to recycle nitrogen back into our forage systems. That's typically only recommended for pasture systems where we can recycle that nitrogen through our livestock back into that warm season perennial system through their feces and urine. So what we want to look at with this particular result demonstration is how the impact of overseeding these cool season forages such as legumes in a warm season perennial system, how it can impact our potential for weed populations during that spring transition period. So like I said, the interest is primarily for recycling nitrogen, but there is a benefit to utilizing these primarily spring producing forages for providing some competition against weed populations that can become dominant in our warm season perennial systems during this spring transition period.
Talking about clover in the regional area, generally what happens is that we just don't see the adoption of clovers like we did several years ago, and mainly because of the cost involved in liming materials, in seed cost and fuel cost, and we just don't have very many producers implementing the clover program anymore. However, it is a practice that could certainly be of value to producers because you're looking at nitrogen being recycled onto that property. You're also looking at protein and energy from grazing that particular crop. And also, as it's already been said, weed control can certainly be helped as well. And so those are some of the positive things about utilizing clovers in a forage system. Okay, so we're going to take this frame and we're going to lay it down in this clover field here just to demonstrate what's there as far as the growth of the clover. And we're going to also compare this to another field where there is no clover growing to show you the difference in forage versus weeds.
So the likely outcomes from this result demonstration is to provide a great illustration of how these cool season forages can reduce bare ground exposure during our winter-spring period. Obviously, if we don't have actively growing vegetation, it's very easy for undesired species, broadleaf weeds, or winter grasses that are undesirable to become a dominant species in that environment and start to compete with our warm season perennials for things like moisture, nutrients, space, and sunlight. So when using these forage squares to determine percent cover of weeds or clover in this particular demonstration, no matter the size of the pasture, we would recommend that you take at least 4 randomly selected locations where you place the square down or you toss the square down, and you collect data in regards to what's the percentage of clover or what's the number of weeds in this 1 meter square. You would do the same in a field where you do not have any overseeded cool season forages, whether that's a clover or a cool season grass, and collect the same information. Obviously, without the legume or without the cool season grass, you would primarily be counting or taking a percentage of weed population within this 1 meter square.
Once we've collected our data, we can compare the average of percentage of weeds in a field with cover crops and a field without cover crops. As expected, we had a lower percentage of weeds where cover crops had been planted versus where cover crops were not planted. The utilization of cover crops during the cool season helps to create competition against any weed seeds that might try to germinate during that time. The cover crop, since it's actively growing during that season, helps to create competition by taking up space, utilizing sunlight and nutrients and moisture that are available, as opposed to potential weed species that might pop up. So this can be a part of an overall weed management strategy. For this demonstration, you'll need a few items. The first item is a meter squared frame that can easily be constructed by materials that you might have on hand or by utilizing some PVC pipe that's purchased from a local hardware store. Of course, you will also need pastures or fields that have been planted with a cover crop and a field or pasture that has not been planted with a cover crop. You do want to make sure these fields are in similar environments or in close proximity so that they are on similar soil types as well as under similar environmental conditions.
A few notes with this result demonstration. It is critical to make sure that when you are comparing a location that has been overseeded with clover versus a field that has not, you want to make sure it's in a very similar soil type. And for us, these pastures are on the same property, extremely similar soil type. Most of the management is very similar, except for this pasture was not overseeded with any cool season annual legumes versus the previous pasture. It will be important as you think about using or doing a clover result demonstration that you are selecting a clover species that is well adapted to that location. If that location is a sandy soil that is well drained versus a bottom location. So the location on the property or even your location within the state can greatly influence what species are going to be best adapted to that environment. So a good idea might be to take a single pasture on a producer's property and split it in half in regards to where you are planting that legume or potentially overseeding that legume versus where you are not. There are a lot of factors that could influence the success of this result demonstration. Our clover production is primarily influenced by rainfall. So if we have a good year where we have good moisture, you can have a bumper crop of clover versus a year where we have a very dry winter and dry spring. That can greatly influence that clover production. And so that could influence your results as far as how much competition you have from that clover against those weed species. Also know that our clovers can mature at different times of the year. Crimson clover matures fairly early for us in East Texas, typically on average about February. So that early maturing legume could actually provide more competition than a legume that might mature later in the season. So you will need to keep that in mind as you are selecting the species for your particular demonstration.
One of the most probably compelling impacts of this demonstration, or most compelling outcomes of this demonstration, is the enhanced pasture productivity when overseeding with clover. This introduces a highly nutritious source of forage in the spring for cattle grazing pastures. Legumes are very high in protein. This could be particularly important for spring calving herds, for cows that are milking calves and that have a higher nutrient requirement because of their increased lactation needs. Because legumes are natural nitrogen fixers, there's also a reduced need for synthetic fertilizers in pastures as well. Overall, forage production is increased, soil health is increased, and biodiversity is increased as well. It's a win-win situation.